Really quick bio on myself. As Brother Paul said, I'm a blood relative of Frederick Douglass, who's actually Frederick Bailey, right? He changed his name to Douglass when he escaped to freedom because of the fugitive slave law that could allow any master of any enslaved African to go into a free state and take him back. So he had to change his last name, and he settled on Douglass because it was suggested to him by one of his white abolitionist friends. But he was Frederick Bailey. Bailey is still my family's name. Many of my relatives are still carrying the last name of Bailey. We go back to Talbot County, Maryland. Our very first patriarch of the family, who was an enslaved African, probably from the coast of Nigeria. We say that because my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who raised Uncle Frederick and his brother, who was my great-great-great-grandfather, Stephen Henry Bailey, was known for being able to catch fish with her bare hands in the waters of Maryland. And because there are certain cultural groups in Nigeria where the women are known to go fishing with their bare hands, many suggest that that is probably where my family came from. She also had a Dr. George Washington Carver type of ability to talk to plants and flowers and make them grow. Grandma Betsy was known around Maryland. Many of the farmers and families would actually call on her to come and help their crops grow when they were having trouble, particularly in the wintertime. She was a leader in the enslaved African community, and she imparted that wisdom on to Uncle Frederick and Grandpa Stephen, who went on to open an African Methodist Episcopal church. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I was born and raised. High school, I went to a military school, Scotland School for Veterans Children, which was one of only 2 residential state-funded military schools in the nation. I went to Millersville University State Teachers College in Pennsylvania, double majored psychology and political science, but because psychology was and is my first love, I stayed with that, came out of undergrad in '97 with a BA in Psych, BS in Poli-Sci. I went right back for my school psychology master's degree. I got certified as a school psych in the state of PA in '01. Then I went right back for my doctorate in clinical psychology. I am a Garveyite. I make no qualms about it. Every leader you get in America, from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad on down, were also Garveyites. Mr. Garvey actually named his first black Star Line steamship corporation the SS Frederick Douglass. So there's a natural connection for me between Garvey and Douglass, although Douglass was an integrationist and Garvey was a Pan-Africanist. But nonetheless, they had a lot more in common, I would argue, than they had in terms of differences there. But you'll see when you study Frederick Douglass that there's a lot of nationalistic elements to his personality. That is because many of Frederick Douglass's friends and colleagues were the grandfathers of Pan-African nationalism. Martin Delany, who actually spent his childhood in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where my high school was and is, was a colleague of Frederick Douglass. He also ran with Henry Highland Garnett, who is one of the grandfathers of Pan-African nationalism, who's the first black man to give the first black minister to give a speech on the floor of the United States Congress. Henry Highland Garnett started the African Civilization Society. Frederick Douglass was also a colleague of Alexander Crummell, who was the first teacher of W.E.B. Du Bois. Alexander Crummell started the first higher institute of learning for black men in America, the American Negro Academy. He went to Africa, Liberia, gave Liberia 20 years of his life, came on back. There's also the Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, who's in a picture back there, who was the first chaplain general in the United States Army, okay, was also a colleague of Frederick Douglass. All these great men we need to study, because Douglass is often studied in a vacuum. Not at all. Douglass was part of a larger Pan-Africanist tradition, which he at one time embraced before renouncing. One of the reasons we as African people have to try to stay with our own women when we get married and our own men when we get married is because when a child is biracial, from everything I've studied on Frederick Douglass, Barack Obama, and others, when a child is biracial, there is something about the psychology of a biracial child that prevents them from being able to grasp the concept of African race first in everything they do, as taught by Marcus Garvey and the other men that I just named. I think because Frederick Douglass's father was a white man, although he never acknowledged him, and I think the fact that Mr. Obama's mother is a white woman, I think it prevents them from going hard on the race question. And when you study Africa, when you study the fall of Africa, you will find that Africa was not destroyed by white armies. Africa was destroyed by mulatto armies. What normally happened was the European conquerors came into Africa, cohabitated with the women, and over the process of 20 to 40 years, they changed the color. And then they used their mulatto offspring to fight against their darker brothers. Something that still goes on today in America. In fact, in Nigeria, as we speak, the Orientals who have invaded the Nigerian economy are marrying African women to do the same thing, to bastardize the native population, to raise up an entire group of Oriental African children who they will then use to oppress the native Africans.
People have bastardized other people through their women and used the bastard to control them.
The mulatto has been the white man's most effective agent in helping destroy black civilization. That's powerful. They have been the most effective assistant to the European. History speaks the truth.
When you don't study your history, you repeat it. So, we're going to talk about the 7 deadly sins. As I said a minute ago, much of what we suffer as a race of people is deliberate. It is organized. It's amazing how much black people blame themselves for the causes of this situation, as opposed to being able to wake themselves up into a larger consciousness to truly see that what goes on with you has been engineered. The psychotropic drug movement, totally engineered. This whole ADHD thing, conduct disorder, it's all been engineered. It comes out of the Federal Anti-Violence Initiative program, which comes out of the 1980s. If you go back in your memory, you will remember that in the 1980s, the United States government was pouring money into a research project to determine whether or not there was a gene in black men that predisposed them to violence. Everybody remember that? It was about 30 years ago. Because of the massive outcry against that movement, it went underground. Most of us think that it went away. It never went away. One thing you got to understand about the United States government or any imperial power, whatever it starts, it finishes. And this is where we go wrong. Whatever it starts, it finishes. Okay? So it went underground. And it came back as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, conduct disorder, opposition to defiant disorder, all of which come out of not only the Federal Anti-Violence Initiative, but the new COINTELPRO against the black community. For example, any black boy in America who's diagnosed with a disruptive behavior disorder, which basically means at some future point in time, they could cause a serious problem to the establishment, the FBI automatically has access to their psychological evaluation reports. Let me say that again. Any black boy in America diagnosed with a disruptive behavior disorder, the FBI automatically has access to the psychological reports. Because as J. Edgar Hoover said, the goal of the FBI is to do what? Prevent the rise of another black messiah. We also know that the FBI was created on who? The Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. J. Edgar Hoover's first full-time job with the FBI was to do what? Bring down greatest leader of the 19th century, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. COINTELPRO is still here. It's in the form of the disruptive behavior disorders, engineered by the government, the FBI, and who's the third factor? The drug companies. One thing you got to understand about psychology, it's no longer a true science. Psychology has become psychoeconomics. The makers of Ritalin and Strattera and Prozac and Cycler, and the list goes on, the makers of these major black psychotropic drugs are the #1 financiers of the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the National Institute of Mental Health. What I'm trying to get you to understand is much of the diagnoses, much of the disruptive behavior diagnoses that we use on black children were paid for by the drug companies. The drug exists before the diagnosis. You need to understand this. The drug exists before the diagnosis. The diagnosis is created to feed the prescription. The diagnosis is created to feed the description of the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. You should have a copy of this. Buy one if you don't. You need it if you're a parent, if you work with children. This is the Bible of psychology and psychiatry. Anything we diagnose comes out of this book. The interesting thing about this book is on the back cover, there's a picture. It says American Psychiatric Association 1844 with a picture of Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was also dean of the medical school at Pennsylvania Hospital. But more importantly, he was a psychiatrist who used to diagnose enslaved Africans with a mental disorder called nigritude. The chief symptom of nigritude, according to Benjamin Rush, was the turning of the skin black. He was actually the father of American segregation because he said that blacks had to be separated from whites because if whites rubbed up against black skin, they would catch nigritude and thusly their brains would be useless. His picture is not on there by accident.
In fact, racism is inseparable from the roots of psychiatry.
The entire history of psychiatry, beginning with scientific conclusions that were made in the 1830s, was an effort to prove the intellectual inferiority of African Americans.
Benjamin Rush is the father of modern psychiatry, and he is the one that gave us the term nigritude. He said that all blacks have inherited this disease, and this particular disease, it caused them to be inferior. In addition to that, it was the reason why it was very important that blacks remain segregated and separate from whites so that whites did not inherit this disease.
Asserting that negritude was a form of leprosy, Rush justified segregation as a medical necessity, and that became an argument to continue slavery.
The fact that you have brutalized a whole group of people had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with some genetic link, and that basically you were just a diseased person. So when a slave master wanted to get rid of a recalcitrant slave, they could just say, oh, well, they're suffering from this disease.
Drapetomania, that is the name of the mental disorder that was contrived by Samuel Cartwright, who said that blacks have a mental disorder if they had a desire to run away from slavery.
Running away became such a common problem that psychiatrists attempted to give that a disease. He says, but that's a cure for that. And the question was, well, what's the cure for that? Frequent whippings, frequent whippings. You'd be surprised how that disease clears up when the lash is put in place of their excuses.
Normality as a concept is more or just as much a political or economic concept as it is a psychological concept. Yet most people think of it as a psychological concept. You see, who defines what is normal, and in what way does behaving normally, according to their definition, operate in their interest? You see, so talking about normal and abnormal behavior, you're not just talking about designating behavior. Behind the labeling of behavior as normal or abnormal is a whole political and economic program. And therefore, behind the whole facade of psychology as a helping profession is really the whole nature of domination and control.
This is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I'm going to give you some of the chief symptoms. Listen to this. Often fails to give close attention to details, is careless in schoolwork, has difficulty sustaining attention in task or play, often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly, often does not follow through on instructions or fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace, often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities, often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort, such as schoolwork or homework, often loses things necessary for tasks or activities, is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, is often forgetful in daily activities. Who in here does this not describe once in a while?